There is a case in Tucson that has stretched across more than 10 weeks without a resolution. And this week, two separate threads of that case pulled in opposite directions at the same moment. One thread pointed toward evidence inside a federal laboratory that could identify a suspect. The other pointed toward the people responsible for managing the investigation and raised questions about whether those people are equal to the task in front of them. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since early February. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, and her disappearance was classified as an abduction almost from the moment it was reported. That classification brought federal resources into the case. The FBI is now actively analyzing DNA evidence recovered from her home, specifically hair samples found inside the residence, material that investigators believe could be directly connected to whoever took her. According to sources familiar with the investigation, those samples have been described as potentially critical. They are currently inside an FBI laboratory, being processed through a complex forensic analysis that has not yet produced a final result. That is one thread. The other thread involves the agency handling the local investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, and a set of events in recent days that have raised serious questions about both its competence as an organization and the character of its leadership. A public alert. A former superior's public statement. A backlash that has not fully subsided. And a sheriff who has not provided the kind of public response that the situation would seem to call for. Viewers who have been following this case deserve both threads, held together in the same analysis. Because what happens inside a laboratory this week may ultimately matter less than whether the people charged with acting on that information are capable of doing so without creating new problems in the process. The situation in Tucson is more complicated than it looks from the outside, and that complexity matters. Because a woman's life may depend on how well or how poorly these systems work together in the days and weeks ahead. Start with what the FBI has and what it is doing with it, because that is where the factual foundation of this story rests. When investigators returned to Nancy Guthrie's home, they were not simply re-walking familiar ground or going through motions for the sake of visible activity. According to sources with knowledge of the investigation, they discovered hair samples that had not previously been flagged as significant. This is worth sitting with for a moment. We are now past 10 weeks in an investigation that has had federal resources attached to it since early in the case. The fact that hair samples are being elevated to critical status now suggests either that they were collected earlier and not prioritized until other avenues were explored, or that a more thorough processing of the residence was conducted recently and produced material that earlier searches had missed. Either scenario raises its own set of questions, but neither diminishes the potential significance of what investigators now have. Those samples were described by sources as potentially critical, language that does not appear in law enforcement communications casually. When investigators or their sources describe evidence as critical during an active abduction case, they are communicating a specific assessment. They believe the material in question has a direct bearing on identifying a suspect. Not a peripheral connection, not a circumstantial link, a potential identification. That is the level at which this evidence is being treated. Those samples are now being analyzed at an FBI laboratory. The process involves extracting a DNA profile from the hair and comparing it against known samples in an attempt to match the extracted profile to an individual. If a hair has a root attached, investigators work with nuclear DNA, which is the most specific and definitive form of genetic identification. If the hair was shed naturally without the root, they work with mitochondrial DNA, which is less individual-specific, but still a powerful analytical tool. The distinction between these two forms matters for the strength of any eventual match. The process, however, has been complicated by one significant factor. The initial results came back with what sources describe as a mixed DNA profile. A mixed result means that the genetic material of more than one person is present within the extracted sample. In a home environment, this is not surprising. Homes accumulate biological material from everyone who passes through them over time. But a mixed profile does mean additional analytical work is required before a conclusion can be reached. The FBI confirmed the analysis is ongoing. The Pima County Sheriff's Department said on day 75 that DNA analysis continues and offered nothing further. What this means in practical terms is that investigators may already have information encoded in that laboratory material that points directly at a suspect. The process of confirming that information is what takes additional time. Time is a factor in this case that carries its own weight. If you are watching this report and have been following the Guthrie case over these past weeks, please subscribe so you can stay with this story as it develops. Now, the harder part of this report, and it must be addressed directly. The Pima County Sheriff's Department sent a public alert this week. That alert contained the words that anyone following this case had been waiting to see. Nancy has been located. 4 words, clear meaning. For anyone who received that message, who has been watching this story, who has thought about Nancy Guthrie and her family over these 10+ weeks, those 4 words meant one thing. She was found. The search was over. The family had received the news they had been waiting for. She was not found. The alert was not accurate in the way those words communicate to any plain language reader. What it actually meant, according to the eventual correction that followed, was something less than what it said. The distinction between what was sent and what was true created a wave of public reaction that was immediate, widespread, and entirely understandable. People had processed, however briefly, a resolution that did not exist. The correction came after the fact, but you cannot uncreate a moment. You cannot unsend a message that told thousands of people that something had happened when it had not. The emotional dimension of this kind of error should not be minimized. For families, friends, community members, and the large national audience that has been engaged with this case, the experience of believing the news had come and then having that belief pulled back is not a minor administrative inconvenience. It is a specific kind of harm. False relief, followed by the return to uncertainty, is harder to carry than sustained uncertainty alone. It resets people's emotional processing in a way that is jarring and that can produce lasting skepticism about future communications from the same source. The sheriff's office has not provided a comprehensive explanation of what happened. The correction came. The explanation did not follow. Questions about who drafted the alert, what approval process it went through, what it was intended to say, and why the gap between the intended meaning and the received meaning was allowed to reach the public have not been answered. In a case this sensitive, that kind of gap in institutional accountability is not a small thing. It becomes more significant in combination with the separate criticism directed at the sheriff himself. A former superior, someone who describes direct, sustained professional experience working alongside the current sheriff, used specific language to characterize him publicly during an active investigation. Vindictive. Bully. Those are words chosen with intention. They are not the language of someone who disagrees with a budget decision or a personnel policy. They are words that describe a person's fundamental way of operating in a position of authority, and they were used by someone who claims to have observed that behavior firsthand. The sheriff's office has not formally responded to those statements. Whether that non-response is a strategic calculation or an absence of an adequate rebuttal is something only the department knows. But in the middle of an investigation this high profile and this emotionally charged, the silence has consequences. It allows the characterization to stand unchallenged in the public record, and the public record of how this case has been managed locally is one that any eventual prosecution will have to account for. Federal investigators operate at a level of institutional insulation that county leadership cannot easily penetrate. The FBI's work is not directed by the Pima County Sheriff. That is structurally important. It means the forensic analysis of the hair samples proceeds on its own timeline, governed by scientific standards and federal protocols, regardless of what is happening locally. That is a real protection. But investigations are collaborative enterprises that require information sharing and operational coordination between agencies. An environment of reduced credibility and public trust around the local agency makes that coordination more difficult to sustain. And in a case where every week without resolution carries its own weight, making anything more difficult is a cost that cannot be ignored. There is a dimension to this case that has stayed largely in the background in public coverage, but deserves direct and focused attention. A second ransom note has surfaced in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. The first note was recovered early on and established the framing that this case has operated within for the past 10+ weeks. It confirmed that Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was not simply a missing person situation. It confirmed that someone took her with a specific purpose, one that involved a financial demand and an expectation of communication. That frame directed the investigation toward the possibility of a negotiation process, toward the financial backgrounds and relationships of those connected to the Guthrie family, and toward the kind of forensic analysis that ransom communications invite. The second note changes the analytical picture in ways that are important to understand. A first ransom note can be explained by multiple scenarios. An opportunistic abductor who made an initial demand and then assessed the situation. Someone who staged a kidnapping and created a note to establish a false frame. Someone with a genuine, long-term criminal plan that includes sustained communication. A single communication cannot easily distinguish between those possibilities. A second note, sent weeks after the first, narrows the interpretive space significantly. It means whoever sent it made a deliberate decision to maintain contact. It means they are still present in the situation, still pressing whatever demand or agenda the first note established. It means the abduction, whatever its current state, has not simply dissolved into silence. The person or persons behind it are actively engaged. And active engagement means there is an ongoing thread that investigators can potentially follow. Ransom communications are forensic evidence in their own right, separate from their content. The material they are written or printed on carries information. The instrument used to produce them carries information. The phrasing, word choice, and grammatical structure carry information about the education, linguistic background, and possible geographic origin of the writer. Forensic linguists are sometimes brought into high-profile cases specifically to analyze communications of this kind, and their findings can contribute meaningfully to the identification of a suspect. Whether that level of analysis has been applied to the second note in the Guthrie case is not something law enforcement has addressed publicly. What is known is that police took what they characterized as a major move directly following its emergence. That is language that suggests action rather than intake. It suggests that something in the content or context of the second note gave investigators something specific to act on. Whether that action involved a surveillance change, a direct approach to a person of interest, an operational response in the field, or something else entirely, has not been disclosed. Police also returned to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood following the note's emergence. Patrols were increased. Residents noticed and reported the heightened presence. Law enforcement attributed the return to both community concerns and new information pointing them back toward the area. The combination of a second ransom note and a return to the neighborhood suggests that the second communication contained geographic or contextual information relevant to the area where Nancy Guthrie lived. That is not confirmed, but it is a plausible reading of the available facts. The neighborhood patrol increase also serves a secondary function that is worth acknowledging. In a case that has received significant national attention, a visible law enforcement presence in the affected community does important work beyond pure investigation. It communicates to residents that the situation is being taken seriously. It creates a visible deterrent, and it allows officers to make observations and have conversations with residents that might not happen in a less structured way. Informal neighborhood intelligence has broken cases before. The return to familiar streets is not only symbolic. The connection between the second ransom note, the return to the neighborhood, and the DNA evidence now being processed by the FBI is something that investigators likely understand better than they are prepared to say publicly. Whether those three threads are converging on the same individual, whether the geographic, forensic, and communication evidence are all pointing in the same direction, is the question that matters most right now. And it is the question that has no public answer yet. There is a final layer to this case that brings everything back to the human dimension at the center of it. Savannah Guthrie carries this investigation in a way that most people connected to high-profile cases do not. She is a public figure with a recognized, trusted presence. She appears on television in front of a national audience on a regular basis. She has a professional identity that exists entirely independently of her role as the daughter of a missing woman. And this week, she left her broadcast unexpectedly, mid-show, in a departure that was visible and unplanned. The reaction from viewers was immediate. People who have been following her mother's case and who are aware of what this family is living through did what they have been trained by this story to do. They read the departure as a possible signal. They wondered whether something had happened, whether news had come, whether the investigation had produced the kind of development that would require a daughter to leave her professional responsibilities and respond as a family member. No statement was issued connecting the departure to the investigation. No statement was issued distancing the departure from the investigation. The silence around the exit, while entirely understandable from a personal privacy standpoint, created a space that the audience immediately filled with interpretation. That is the reality of navigating a situation like this in public. Every absence becomes presence. Every unexplained action carries the weight of everything the audience already knows. A journalist who has been reporting on this case closely revealed this week that he has a specific question he has been waiting to ask Savannah Guthrie, one he has not yet had the opportunity to put to her. He declined to identify the question. The disclosure was enough to signal that those professionally closest to this story believe there is something in Savannah Guthrie's perspective, knowledge, or experience that the public has not yet had access to. What that might be is genuinely impossible to know. It could be a private observation about her mother's life or habits before the disappearance. It could be a perspective on the investigation itself. It could be something entirely personal that has no direct bearing on the case. The fact that a journalist with sustained professional proximity to this investigation believes the question is worth waiting for suggests it is not trivial. And it is a reminder that the public narrative of any case, however comprehensive, is never the complete story. Families in situations like this are routinely guided by investigators about what to say publicly and when. The reasons for that guidance are legitimate and numerous. Information shared publicly can reach the wrong person. It can affect witness accounts. It can compromise operational decisions. It can shift the dynamic between investigators and the person or persons they are pursuing. Whether Savannah Guthrie is operating under any such guidance is not something that has been confirmed. Her public statements about her mother's situation have been limited and careful. What is possible to say, looking at everything that has emerged this week, is that this investigation is at a point where the forensic evidence being processed in a federal laboratory represents the clearest path forward that exists in the public record. There is a second ransom note confirming the situation is active. There is DNA evidence that sources describe as potentially critical. There is a neighborhood under increased patrol. And there is a local law enforcement agency that is managing public trust in a way that has introduced friction into a case where friction is the last thing anyone needed. In the middle of all of it is a woman who has not been home in 75 days. The science is working. The systems around it are imperfect. The outcome remains entirely uncertain, and the investigation continues.